In this segment, we're going to talk about feudalism and manorialism. Feudalism is the structure that undergirded the political systems of medieval Europe, and manorialism is the term that's often used to refer to the economic component of those systems. Feudalism emerged with the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, and along with it, the monetary based economy that had undergirded Roman society for centuries. What emerges is a much more rural, agricultural, land based economy in which land becomes the most important object to possess. If one does not possess land, one does not possess wealth, power, or influence. The only way someone who is landless is able to gain any kind of mobility in medieval society is by aligning themselves with someone who does. And so you get these very powerful figures, such as kings, emperors, and then below them, nobility of various levels, who possessed land. And in order to accumulate power for themselves, what they'll do is subdivide that land and they'll bestow that land upon those who are landless. Those who are landless will agree to certain obligations, obligations that come to be known as feudal obligations, that will then bind them to that land and also to that lord. Vassals will serve on the land, yielding some of the produce from that land as their payment to their feudal lord. In some cases, where a vassal possesses enough means to equip themselves with a horse and possibly a suit of armor, that vassal will be known as a knight, and they will render, as part of their feudal obligations, military service as well. Vassals will serve their time on the land, and sometimes they can change lords, but most often they're bound to the same lords for a lifetime. There are some vassals who are so low in the feudal system that their obligations go beyond their lifetime. These vassals are known as serfs. Serfs are persons bound to the land, and while their status is not necessarily the same as that of a slave in other societies, they don't have much voluntary movement, and therefore, for all practical intents and purposes, they are bound to the land, they're bound to their lord, and enjoy a status very close to that of slaves in many of the other societies that we've looked at. When a lord bestows a feudal possession or a tract of land on a vassal, that bestowed land is known as a fief or a feudum. And that's where you get the term feudalism or feudal system. And so a fief is a grant of land bestowed on a vassal. A grant of land that's bestowed on someone who also has a clerical position, in other words, an ecclesiastical person, someone who serves as a priest or is attached to some monastic order. That grant of feudal land is known as a benefice. And the bestowal of a benefice illustrates the complexity of this feudal system and how complicated it can get. Now, based on the way that it's envisioned, ideally, it's a straight up and down sort of system. In fact, often the term is used, the great chain of being, to describe the system. The great chain of being is seen as an extended straight line, a stratified line, straight from God in heaven down to the lowest serf in medieval society. This ideal is linked very much with notions of chivalry and knightly honor and virtue as well that began to arise in the 11th and 12th centuries, particularly in the songs of French troubadours who are wanting to exalt the chivalric ideal as the noble code for the way that knights operate. There's probably some truth that knights held these ideals, but the notion that they followed them very closely probably resides more in the realm of troubadour songs and fantasy than it does in the actual lived reality of medieval people. This is the way the system was intended to look, at least in its ideal. And you could place above the king in this illustration God in heaven. And the notion was that people are born into a certain status, that God places them there, and that they're meant to live out that status for the rest of their lives. There's no notion in this world of social mobility as we know it now. For us, it's part of the quote American dream that someone can rise from humble circumstances and become someone exalted and great. One of the interesting ironies of Kingdom of Heaven, which we watched a couple of weeks ago, is that Bellion can come from nothing in the Kingdom of Jerusalem to rise to the status of nobility. Now, as we discussed, the historical Bellion did no such thing. He was born into nobility. But it is true that part of the allure of the Crusades for many of those who fought them was this idea that one could start over, one could go to this new world, and there was the possibility of social mobility. Where they came from, there was almost none. There were very few ways to improve your station and your status. And so you get this very stratified sort of system from the king down to lords, dukes, earls, down to knights on horseback who can render military service, down finally to poor peasant farmers who worked the land all their lives and lived by the leave and grace of the lords who bestowed the land upon them which they worked. And in return, they yielded the produce every year as it was brought in from the harvest. And so it's a very, very fixed sort of society, at least in the minds of those who rule it and in the minds of many of those who live in it who see no hopes of bettering their station. But there's a lot of complexity underneath this simple outline. For instance, there are some persons who could be vassals of more than one lord. Some persons had land in one region, which they had secured from one feudal lord, and then they secured a second vassalage in another region. And this would lead to split loyalties in times of conflict. Also, you could have major overlords, for instance, the King of England, Henry II, who became king in 1154. He actually ruled territory in France by virtue of the fact that his ancestors had invaded the British Isles from France. They held the Duchy of Normandy, and under William the Conqueror in the year 1066, they had invaded England. What this meant is Henry had inherited land from both his mother and his father, which was French territory. And technically, by the laws of the feudal system, he was both the King of England, the overlord of all persons in England who held land, but also technically a vassal of the King of France. This obviously didn't work out well, and there were many opportunities for conflict to arise between Henry II and the King of France. It didn't help that Henry's wife, Eleanor, also owned extensive holdings in Aquitaine. And oh, yes, at one time she had been married to the King of France and had divorced him in order to marry Henry II. So there was no end of trouble between Henry II and the King of France, nor the next King of France who came after the one that Henry had known better. And so this seemingly straightforward system could have all kinds of interlocking loyalties and allegiances, provide all kinds of opportunities for people to stab one another in the back. This could very much become as complicated as an episode of Game of Thrones in regard to shifting allegiances and loyalties. And so what appears on the surface to be a very simply organized way to hold medieval society together was actually infinitely more complicated than it appears on the surface. And it also yielded a lot of tensions that would result in conflicts between church and state. If someone holds a benefice and they got it from a noble lord who is a secular personage, someone from the outside of the church hierarchy, then there's certain obligations that that clerical person who owns the benefice owes to that feudal lord. There are times also when the church acquires property and various leading ecclesiastical officials become feudal lords. And they have working for them persons that are not taking any kind of priestly or monastic vows, but who are under their authority nonetheless. These overlapping spheres of authority between church and state, they end up eliciting a number of major conflicts. One of the biggest ones is the so-called investiture controversy, which erupted between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy in the 1000s and 1100s. This controversy became a fiery conflict because essentially the Pope is arguing that they should have the ability to be able to uh, have a say in the affairs of the Holy Roman Empire, whereas the Holy Roman Emperor says that not only should he be able to question papal decisions in regard to the territory he controls, but he also should be appointing those persons who both held ecclesiastical offices and held land in the territory of the Holy Roman Empire. He said that as the secular lord of that area, he should decide who held those clerical appointments because they also had authority over people who were his subjects. At one moment in 1076, this conflict became so furious that the Pope placed an interdict on the Holy Roman Empire, essentially excommunicating the entire region. And in order to get him to remove it, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, actually went to the castle of Canossa, where the Pope at that time, Gregory VII, was staying, and knelt in the snow for 72 hours, begging the Pope to lift the interdict that had been placed on the Holy Roman Empire. The Pope did this eventually, and decreed that he would accept Henry IV's gesture of repentance. And for a while, things continued in that sort of tense, uneasy situation. Later on, Henry IV would get back at the Pope by invading Rome. And so there was no love lost between the two. This episode illustrates, among many episodes that could also illustrate, how tense relations between church and state could become because of that overlapping of the feudal system with the ecclesiastical structures of medieval Europe as well. So the feudal system and manorialism, they undergirded both the political and economic structure of medieval Europe, and in some ways they seem to provide a recipe for stability, but there was always the possibility that they could also issue in disorder and conflict.